Although learning disabilities are different for each child, the challenges, of course, are quite similar. The good news is that a child with a learning disability can still learn. Beverly Stewart, president and founder of Back to Basics Learning Dynamics, is here to explain all of that. Good morning. How are you?
Hi, great, Greg.
Let's talk about learning disabilities. So many different kinds, and you can't put them all into one group. What do educators define as a learning disability?
Actually, it's defined by psychologists, and it's a large gap between someone's IQ and their abilities. In other words, the average IQ is 100, the exact average 100. If someone has a 130 IQ, you would expect that they'd be learning to read early, they'd be verbal, and all kinds of other skills would be early learned, and they'd be real strong and intelligent. If they are a 130 IQ, this is just an example, and they're not reading by, say, second grade, then there's probably a learning disability going on, or at least it's worth checking into.
Are most learning disabilities caused either by environmental stresses, or are they just simply something that's biological?
That's a great question. Actually, there is no known cause for learning disability. However, a leading theory nowadays states that it is probably some disturbance in the fetal brain development. However, there are also other studies that are showing it could be environmental, but it cannot be cured. It is hereditary. It cannot be treated with medication, cannot be outgrown.
But then how does the parent, so then what is then the good news for the parent of a child with a learning disability? Are there new studies and new methods that are able to help them get a high school education, college education, be able to learn and grow as the rest of their classmates?
Absolutely. The good news is that there are ways to compensate for having that. We all have some kind of non-strength, so we have to compensate for them. So although it cannot be cured, it is definitely compensated for, and having the proper education. They may need to be in special education, have the testing beforehand to make sure they're put in the proper school, proper classes within that school is real key. The education, the early intervention is very important.
We just talked to the folks over at Newsweek magazine. They were talking about the differences between men and boys, between boys and girls, and how the number of young men, young boys in schools, and elementary, middle school, and high school, taking special education is starting to grow. What do you tell the parents with young boys that they're wondering why they're not making the grade? Is it a learning disability? They need to check it out.
Actually, that's been the case for decades, honestly. There have been more boys diagnosed with learning disability than girls. Now it's about twice as many. But I think that, again, since we don't know for sure, it is definitely a genetic situation, but there is possibly some environmental. At early signs, if they're not reaching their developmental milestones, for example, they're not walking, talking within the normal limits, they're not sitting up, standing, communicating with others, that's when the parent really needs to start talking to pediatricians about these concerns, because if they're not within the normal range, there may be developmental delays. And so again, the early intervention is so key.
What about inconsistency in school, like poor attention skills?
Yes.
Again, these are some of the same concerns that when we talked to the folks about Newsweek, they talked about how young boys are having this problem. If there are subtle differences, do you need to seek help?
Normally not. The big key about learning disabilities is that there is a large discrepancy. It is not just a small issue, a small delay, or a small difference between their IQ and their ability. It has to be a marked, significant difference.
And how do we mark that? By the fact that their friends, my next-door neighbor's friends, are getting, their children are getting A's and B's, my son and daughter is getting C's or D's, or is it much more serious than that?
Well, that's a real simplistic view, but that is related to the fact that when they go to a psychologist to have their psychoeducational testing, their tests are based on norms, and they look at age norms. So, you know, again, if a 10-year-old should be doing these things by age 10, or give or take, and they're not, then they put all that into the mix of all the battery of tests. So in a simplistic way, that is part of it.
Then what happens, okay, you mentioned several different age groups. You mentioned, I would look at it almost as a toddler stage, and post-toddler. Then we talked about age 10. What about when they're like 16, 17 years old? Maybe we have started now, high school age. We started to figure out there may be some problems there. Then what do we do? How much can we regroup from, how much can we capture of lost
time? And that is difficult. That's why I talk about catching it early. But there is still hope.
If we catch it late,
yeah, there still is hope. No, there still is hope.
Okay.
But it is unlikely they will ever catch up, because the gap will be too broad, far too great at that time to catch up fully. However, a lot can be done with this hard work from the child, and some intervention such as a tutor will help the student to catch up and start to narrow the gap. we don't often see it close because it is often many years behind at that time.
So you would suggest that we meet with the teacher, observe at home, and talk about formal testing?
Absolutely.
What type of formal testing are we discussing?
It's called psychoeducational testing. It's done by psychologists. We do it at Back to Basics. It is done by a licensed psychologist.
Okay. Beverly Stewart, president and founder of Back to Basics Learning Dynamics. Thank you so much for joining us and talking about an issue that maybe some parents need to discuss. For more information on learning disabilities, you can visit our website at cna.tv/yourmorning. Gwen, over to you.
All right, Greg.